All right, Rabbi, say good morning. A lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. We have a beautiful daf ahead of us. To begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors, Avram and Shindi Kelman, for dedicating all the Shir and Drushos this month in honor of Yechiel's engagement to Alana Falik and in memory of their parents, Strom and Bernice Kelman, Alexander and Frederica David. To thank Barak, Maya, Sandy Hoffman, Dora Limas, and Avi Malamed for dedicating all the Shir and Drushos this month in memory of Ruvain ben Emmanuel. Ayal and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating the Shurim this month in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Shulamis Bas Susha and in the Schus of her continued health. The Daf Yomi Shir in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Yehuda ben Michal. Our week of learning sponsors, Matt and Diane Marks, in honor of the birth of their grandson, Yehuda Yeshaya, may grow in Meretz Hashem to be an incredible Ben Torah and a source of nachos. Our Daf Yomi sponsor is actually from yesterday, but I forgot to announce it. Baruch Meir and Rina Dubin, wishing a mazel tov to Diane and Matt Marks on the occasion of the birth and bris of their new grandson, Yehuda Yeshaya. May he grow to Torah, to Chuppah, and to Maisim Tovim. Wishing Meretz Hashem, all of us should have continued simchas nachas from our children. Kol Chole Yisrael should have a complete and enduring refuah. The neshamas should have an aliyah, and the families a nechama. Rabbi, with that, let us begin. So a lot to do today. Meretz Hashem. We are picking up. Today's daf is Nun Hey 55. Let's pick up at the new Mishnah on the new parak in Meretz Hashem on Nun Dalid Amud Beis 54b. Rabbi, say really interesting sugya ahead of us. Says the Mishnah, Afa pi sha'amru besula gova masayim va'almana amana. Even though we've established that a besula gets a ksuva of 200 zuz and an almana a ksuva of 100. Imrotza lahosif afilu mea mana yosef. If the husband wants to add on to the ksuva, he has the ability to do so. Even if he wants to add on an exorbitant amount of money, that is his prerogative. Nis armala onis garsha. If a woman is divorced, or I should say, if she's widowed or divorced, whether she's divorced from erisin or from nisuin, gova esakol. Gova esakol. Tanakam Rabosai holds that she collects the entire ksuba. So entire meaning what? Entire meaning ikr and tosefes. Right? Tzalocha l'maisa, whether she is widowed or divorced from erisin or from nisuin, she collects the ksuba in its entirety. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says no. Mina nisuin gova esakol. Ultimately, again, from nisuin, she collects everything. Mina erisin, however, again, if she's widowed or divorced from erisin, besula gova masayim v'almona mona. A besula collects 200 and an almona collects 100. So Rabbi say, what's interesting, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah holds that really from erisin only ikr ksuva, the primary part of the ksuva, is collectible. Any tosefes, any additional amounts are not. But from nisuin, the entire thing is collectible. Shelo kasav la ela amanas lakonsa. Because what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's logic is, a man only writes tosefes with the intention, ultimately again, of fully marrying her, i.e. nisuin. Rashi says over here, shelo kasav la tosefes demidaito ela amanas lakonsa. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, ikr ksuva ultimately is from erisin, but the tosefes, the additional amounts, only takes place. He only has in mind to commit himself to that once nisuin occurs. Okay, so the Gemara goes right. Rabbi Huda says, Rabbi Huda Omer, Imratza kosev lebesula shtar shal masayim, v'hi koseves hiskabli mimcha mana, ula amana mana, v'hi koseves hiskabli mimcha chamishim zuz. So Rabbi Huda introduces something very interesting. So there are. First, let's go through the halacha so far. Halacha number one is that a man has the ability to add on to a ksuva. Right? So remember again, we know primary ksuva for a first marriage, 200 mana, second marriage, or non-besula, 100 mana, fine. That's halacha number one. You can add on. How much can you add on? Much as you want. Second halacha, which is a machlokes Tanakama and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, which is about the collectability of a ksuva. Tanakama says, already from erisin, she collects everything. Iker, tosefes, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says no. Iker is collectible as of Erusin. Tosefes only collectible as of Nisuin. Nisuin next. Both say that's part of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda introduces us something interesting. Let's say a man wants to give his wife a diminished ksuva. So we started out the Mishnah with a discussion about adding on to a ksuva. Let's say he doesn't want to add, he wants to diminish. So Rabbi Yehuda says there's a way to do it. How do you do it? So let's say again, Reuven's marrying Rachel, first marriage, he writes her a ksuva of 200 zuz, and she writes back a receipt for 100 zuz. And I both say, did she receive 100 zuz? No. But she's making it as if she received it, i.e., she's being mochelas. She's forgiving a part of the ksuva. So Yehuda Omer, imratza kosev lebesula shtar shamasayim vihi kasva hiskabli mimcha. She can write a document that says, I received 100 zuz from you, or for an almana, he koseves hiskabli mimcha chamishim zuz. Now, if you look at Rashi says, vihinis koseves, afa pi shalonis kablo, mocheles v'koseves pelashon shover. Now I will say, obviously, she hasn't received any money. Essentially, what she is doing is she is forgiving a part of her ksuva. Now I will say, now what's interesting to note over here is this seems like a very convoluted way to go ahead and forgive part of a ksuva. She should just be able to write what? Right? I forgive 100 zuz of my ksuva. I will say, we're going to see, it appears that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha is a man has to write a ksuva of 200 zuz to his wife. Otherwise, he has to write. This is what she's entitled to. There's no such thing as writing a ksuva for less. The way we're going to see in the Gemara, apparently that this is the only way to forgive ksuva. It has to be, the mechanism has to be that she'll write, it's as if I received it. Again, we'll see why it is, but that's Rabbi Yehuda's position. Comes along Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir Omer, Kol hapochis lo usulim imasayim ulamona mimone harei zubi ilasnos. Rabbi Meir says, if you try to write a diminished ksuva, less than 200 for a basula and less than 100 for a beula, ultimately, again, this is a be'ilas znus. This is a living with her will be immorality. Now, what Rabbi Meir means, is he arguing? Is this a different opinion? We'll have to see in the Gemara. Good. Rabbi say that is our Mishnah. So now let's analyze. So we'll say the first part of the Mishnah taught us that if a husband wants to go ahead and increase the ksuva amount, he has the ability to do so. To which the Gemara says, pshita. Okay, well, so that's kind of obvious. Right? In other words, why does the Mishnah... I will say, remember, ksuva is a debt. Ksuva is a debt that a husband owes to the wife. He wants to go out and go above and beyond and make himself indebted to her for a greater amount. Great. As they say. Go for it. Why does the Mishnah have to teach you that this is possible? Very interesting. Kitsusa abdu rabbana shelo levayish es misha ein lo. I will say this is possible. This is possible. This is incredible. I might have thought that Chazal put a cap. They put a ceiling on the ksuva amount. Why? So as not to embarrass someone who doesn't have additional funds. Right? So think about this for just a moment, right? Reuven's marrying Rachel. Reuven is a man of means. So he has the Iker ksuva of 200 zuz and he promises her another $100,000. Right? Shimon is marrying Leah and Shimon doesn't have any money. So he's going to obligate himself obviously to the Iker ksuva, but he doesn't have anything extra. I might have thought that Chazal would put a cap on a ksuva so as not to embarrass people who don't have. I will say, we have halachic precedents for this, right? Where do we see that Chazal legislate ultimately against spending in order not to embarrass? Where do we see this? By levayas, right? By funerals. We saw this by the first time, right? Ultimately, again, we saw this, it was referenced already in Yevamis, that Chazal went ahead and put a cap on burial spending so as not to embarrass people. So I might have thought, therefore, Chazal put a cap on ksuva spending, kamash malon we don't. Now, say, by the way, it raises an interesting point. It's in other words, kamash malon. The Mishnah tells us that you could increase the amount of a ksuva, and effectively you could spend as much as you want on the ksuva. Spend as much as you want on the ksuva. Shabbos say begs the question: why didn't Chazal put a cap on ksuva spending? There's a very simple reason, which is it benefits the woman. In other words, when it comes to spending on the dead, right, I will say that's non-essential spending. right? That's not a good return on investment. So, right? So Lamais, again, Chazal said, if spending on Levayas is going to create unnecessary, right? We'll call it communal pressure, so put a cap on it. But why would we ever put a cap on Kesuva spending? Kesuva spending benefits the woman. If we allow the women in Jewish society to get more money for the Kesuva, giving them more financial security, we're not stepping in on that. Again, but the Havamina is, I would have stepped in order to go ahead and not embarrass those who don't have. Which, by the way, tells you something very interesting. What the Gemara is highlighting to us is that when you can put a cap on communal spending in order not to embarrass people who don't have, and you're not putting anyone at a disadvantage, impose that cap. Which I will say is an interesting thing. We don't have organized Jewish community enough to do these kinds of things, but in the Hasidic communities, they have takanas. In other words, for example, in many of the Hasidic sects, there are caps on how much you are allowed to spend on a wedding, how many people you're allowed to invite to a Sheva Brachas. In other words, we'll say, and these caps are there in order to create a societal norm and in order to avoid unnecessary spending on things where people can't afford it. Because I will say there is a social pressure. Again, it exists even in our community to make a wedding that looks a certain way, to invite a certain number of people. I was recently having a conversation with someone who was marrying off a child, and he said to me, I have only one regret. My regret is that I couldn't have made a chasana during COVID. I wish I could have made a COVID wedding. And at first, I didn't understand what he was saying. And he was saying you remember the COVID weddings? Right? It was around the COVID weddings, right? 10 people, right? I remember because we were involved in some of these conversations with local government about how we need a minyan, right? We need a minyan. It was 10 people. It was in someone's backyard. And I will say, as having attended a number of COVID weddings, they were some of the most meaningful and uplifting events I've ever seen in my entire life, which teaches us such an incredible yesod, that it's not the number of musicians, and it's not the number of people, and it's not this, and it's not that. I'll say, so again, we get lost in all of these things. We just get lost. Unfortunately, we don't have the structure of community to create standards that everyone lives by. But Lamaisi, you see how Chazal went ahead and felt when you could create standards that therefore keep things in a modest fashion so no one gets embarrassed because they don't have, do it. Ksuva, we're not going to do it because halacha lamaisi, you're going to put the woman at a disadvantage. Good, let's go right there. Says the Gemara. In Ratza Lahosif, so Rosa, listen to this. Lo Ratza lichtov lo katani, ella Ratza Lahosif. So I will say this is very interesting. So step number one in the Mishnah is you could add on to a ksuva. Good, that's step number one. Step number two, the Mishnah said, Ratza Lahosif. Now I will say Ratza Lahosif means what? What means what? If you want to add on. Now the Gemara makes an interesting deal. It doesn't say Imratza Lichtov, right? It doesn't say if he wanted to write, rather it says if he wanted to add. Then I both say, what's the difference between writing and adding? So Misiyelu Rabbi Ivo, the Amr Rabbianai, Tnoi Ksuva, Kiksuva Dami. So I both say, take something very interesting over here. The idea of the Gemara says like this. The chilik is, let's take this case. Reuven is marrying Rachel, first marriage. What's her ksuva amount? 200 zuz, right? Now Reuven wants to add in another 500 zuz. So I will say, here's the shaila. How do you view the additional 500 zuz? Is the additional 500 zuz, does that become part of the ksuva? Or is that essentially just considered to be an additional amount that Reuven owes Rachel, but it's not really part of the ksuva? So let's listen to this. So the Gemara says, if the Mishnah would have written Imratza Lahosif Yichtov, if the Mishnah would have said if Reuven wants to add on 500 zuz, write it up. Write it up sounds like what? This is an additional debt that he owes her. But it doesn't say that. It says Imratza Lahosif Yosef. Yosef means added onto the ksuva, which tells us that any additional agreements to the ksuva become part of the ksuva itself. So now when he goes in and commits himself to an additional 500 zuz, that 500 zuz, which we call Tnai Ksuva, part of the conditions or additional agreements of the Ksuva, become part of the Ksuva itself. Rabbi, say, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Tnai Ksuva, Tosefes, Shehu Matana, or Shumasne, Lahos Nifla, V'chei Mizonos, V'chol Hanach Tisnal Beperekin Dilael. So we'll say, it turns out that our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Ivo, and Rabbi Ivo says, Tnai Ksuva, Ke Ksuva Dami. Additional agreements to the Ksuva become part of the Ksuva itself. It all becomes part of the Ksuva. So we'll say, so this is really incredible. So now, Tosefes Ksuva, any additional amounts that Ruvain adds onto the Ksuva become part and parcel of the Ksuva itself. Now we'll say, what does this matter? So watch this. We're going to go through a series of nafkaminas. Nafkamina, here we go. Let's go through one by one. Mocheres. So Rabbi say, listen to this. Let's say a woman goes ahead and mocheres or mocheles. We actually saw this 2 days ago. Mocheres means she sells her ksuva. Mocheles means she forgives her ksuva. Take a look at Rashi. Mocheres, mocheles. Mocheres ksuvasa, mocheles ksuvasa. Machla u'mocheres hakol. Lefisha hakol kar ksuva. Both listen to this. Let's say Rachel sells her ksuva. Now, could a woman sell her ksuva? Absolutely. She's selling a future. We spoke about this. Now, I say, when Rachel sells her ksuva, what is she selling? What is she selling? And the answer is she's selling everything. Everything means what? The ikr ksuva and any tosefes. Because tosefes, right, any additional amounts, become part of ksuva proper. Same idea if she is mocheles. Let's say she forgives her ksuva. We'll talk about the dynamics of forgiving your ksuva. She forgives her ksuva. Now listen, a woman forgives her ksuva. What is she forgiving? What is she forgiving? Everything. Including, because why? Because the tosefes becomes part of the ikr. Incredible. Next, what's next on the list? Moredes. Shabbos say we will discuss this. As you look at Rashi, moredes. This nan bepirikin hamoredes al baila poches in lo miksuvasa ad masayu poches ad keneged ksuvasa. So listen to this. The case of moredes is a woman who refuses to be intimate with her husband. And I will say, so what we're going to see is the case, which is an interesting case. This is a case of moredes where a woman is using their intimate relationship as a tool against him. Again, we'll discuss if she doesn't want to be intimate to him because she finds him repulsive. She doesn't want to be intimate with him because he's mean. So that's not this discussion. Moredes is the case where she refuses intimacy as a punitive measure. So Chazal penalized her in that case and ultimately diminished her ksuva. So we'll say, how much of her ksuva do we diminish? So again, ksuva includes everything. Ikr, as well as tosefes. Again, we'll see that case in greater pogemes. Look at Rashi, pogemes. Beperak hakosef tram pogemes ksuva. So lo tifra ela b'shvua in pagmo tosefes. Now mishamar l'shem piron ha tosefes hiskabalti. So we're going to see the case of pogemes is like this. Halacha l'maisa, if a woman claims that she receives partial payment on her ksuva, and the husband says, no, I paid you all of the ksuva. Since she admitted that what? She received partial payment, she has to swear about the rest. See, even it's like Modeh B'Mitzvahs kind, right? See, even if she goes ahead and she claims, I received the tosefes, not the ikr, that triggers a shvua on the rest of it. Next, tova'as. The both says goes back to yesterday's daf. And we passed halacha l'maisa. The both say when does mizonos from the estate end? When does it end? The moment she claims her ksuva in Beis Din. Now both say what happens if she claims the tosefes, not the ikr? That's also called claiming the ksuva. So both say remember again, we're just going through a list here of showing that what highlighting the idea that tosefes ksuva is like the ikr ksuva. That ultimately, again, once he commits to the tosefes, that additional amount becomes part of ksuva proper. Next, la'overes al das. Shabbos say overes al das. Look at Rashi. It's actually a very interesting case. Rashi says overes al das beperak hamadir sha'amru ala teitze shalo biksuva lo tema ksuva mana masan val tosefes. Shabbos say we're going to see overes al das. It's an interesting situation, again, which we'll discuss in a couple of weeks from now, is about a woman who is in violation of halacha. When is violation of halacha? So when a woman becomes in violation of halacha, ultimately, again, we begin to either diminish or remove her ksuva. So how much of it is diminished or removed? Everything, including tosefes. Next, top of nun hey, l'shevach. So what's interesting is Tap Rashi, very interesting. Shamru bebechoros ein habechar notel pishnayim b'shevach sheshavchu hanechasim li'achar misas avihen. So we'll say, so here, let me talk about this for just a moment. Father dies, leaves behind an estate. He's behind an estate. So let's say again, he leaves behind the Bechar, a firstborn son. What's the halacha by Bechar? Bechar gets pishnayim, double portion. So I will say, the Bechar gets pishnayim in the estate at the time of the death of the father. Any appreciation that occurs after the death of the father, the Bechar does not get pishnayim. So in other words, what it's saying is that for inheritance law, the value of the estate is locked in at the time of death. So even if there is appreciation between the time of death and the actual chalukah division of the estate, the Bechar will share in that, right? He'll share in that, but he does not get a double portion of that. Similarly, again, I will say, interestingly enough, same idea with ksuva. Value of a ksuva is locked in at the time of death. Even if there is appreciation of the estate between the time of death and ksuva collection, the woman does not share in that appreciation. Okay, that's shevach. Shabbosai, what part of the ksuva does it govern? It governs everything. Shvius, shmita, Shabbosai, the same idea. Remember, ksuva is a debt. So Shabbosai, so again, I can make a good argument that Baruch Hashem, anyone who enjoys marital longevity and therefore is married for more than 7 years, what's the good news for the husband? What's the good news for the husband? Come Shemitah year, what happens? The ksuva is wiped out. Doesn't work that way, right? We'll say ksuva is a debt that remains even through the Shemitah year. Which part of the ksuva? The entirety of the ksuva. Iker and Tosefes. Next, Ulekosef kol nechasav lebanav. So we'll say again, we'll discuss all of these cases. So Kosef kol nechasav lebanav, we'll say, is a man who goes ahead and gives over his property to his children, writes over all of his property to his children, and ultimately goes ahead and identifies a piece of property that he goes ahead and gives to his wife. So essentially what we say is that the entirety of the ksuva is vested in that property. What part of the ksuva? Iker and Tosefes. The ligbos min hakarka. Furthermore, again, remember again, ksuva is a claim which is collectible from real property. Which part of the ksuva? Ultimately, again, Iker and Tosefes, umina ziburis. Ultimately, again, remember, ksuva, I will say this is actually interesting. Anytime you have a debt that is collectible from real property, so the shaila always becomes, what type of real property? There are 3 grades of land. There's idus, beinanis, and ziburis. High quality real estate, middle quality, and inferior quality. Ksuva is a debt which is only collectible from ziburis, lower grade, low quality real estate. So I will say, which part of ksuva? Again, Iker and Tosefes. The chozman shi bevei saviha, and I will say that also the halacha applies as long as she's in her father's home. What does this mean? Look at Rashi. Chozman shi bevei saviha. Tanan bano say chozman shi bevei abayla b'meshach almanusa gove ksuva sali olam v'chein chozman shi bevei saviha shelo hayu ovdim osa yisomim v'lo zanin osa gove ksuva sad kaf hei shanim. Shabbos, it's very interesting. When the husband dies, is there a statute of limitations on the collection of a ksuva? Interesting shaila. So Rabbi say we are going to see that halacha l'maisa, if she is living in her deceased husband's home, there's no statute of limitation. She could collect that ksuva forever. If she moves out of her father's home, of her husband's home, she's living elsewhere. The example they give is she's living in her father's home. She has up to 25 years to collect the ksuva. If after 25 years she has not collected her ksuva, ultimately, again, it is no longer collectible. Which part of the ksuva is no longer collectible? I'll say which part? Entire thing. Iker and Tosefes. And lastly, uliksuvas benin dichrin. And we'll say similarly again for ksuvas benin dichrin, we'll say, which is the halacha that says that the sons inherit their mother's ksuva. Which part of the ksuva do they inherit? Again, the entire ksuva, Iker and Tosefes. So Rabbosai, these were just a number of Rabbosai. So again, just keep our eye on the ball. Remember, the Gemara picking up on the diuk. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said if a man wants to add on to the ksuva of his wife, Ratza lahosif, what's the halacha? Yosef. What do we learn from the word Yosef? What does add on mean? Add on means he's adding on to the Iker ksuva, which tells us Tosefes ksuva, additional amounts, become part of the primary ksuva. So Rabbi says, so now, when Reuven goes ahead and adds on 500 zuz to his wife, the ksuva value is 700 zuz. It's 200 of primary ksuva, 500 of ikr ksuva, of tosefes, but the tosefes becomes part of ksuva proper. The Gemara now just gave us an exhaustive list of how tosefes is like part of ikr. Tosefes is just as much part of the ksuva as the ikr itself. Incredible. Shabbos say, let's go weiter. So now the Gemara says as follows, some interesting halachas. Itmar, ksuvas ben dichrin, so the Gemara says, when it comes to ksuvas ben dichrin, so remember, back to our previous sugya, the ability or the specific clause that male children inherit their mother's ksuva. So when it comes to ksuvas ben dichrin, pumpadisa amri, lo tarfa mishibadi. Shabbos saying pumpadisa, they said, interestingly enough, as much as Shabbos says, remember, I'm going to play this out. Reuven is married to Rachel. Standard in the ksuva, they would write, any sons that we have together will Rachel inherit your ksuva. Our sons will inherit your ksuva, independent of any other inheritance considerations. Okay, now Bosai, so let's say now over the course of marriage, Reuven sold off his properties. So now let's say the estate, so now Rachel dies, and now the sons want to inherit their mother's ksuva. Here's the problem. What's the problem? There's no property in the estate to satisfy the ksuva obligation. So what's the shaila? So I will say a ksuva, right? Rachel, when she was alive, and now when she's dead, her ksuva is a creditor. So now the shaila is, do the sons have the right to seize sold properties in satisfaction of their mother's ksuva? So in Pumpadisa Amri, Lo Tarf Mishibadi, Pumpadisa said no. No. The sons don't have a right to go ahead and seize sold property in order to collect their mother's ksuva. Why? Yarsun to none. Because Abba say the lashon of ksuvas ben dichrin is it's a form of inheritance. And Abba say in inheritance you don't have the right to seize sold property. Abba say, think about it just a moment. Let's say classic inheritance situation. Father dies, right? Sons inherit the estate. Well, when father was alive, he sold off 25 properties. The sons don't have a right to say, well, we're now our father's inheritors, where we're clawing back all the... No, inheritance is when the father dies, whatever is in the estate, that's what you inherit. Whatever he sold off, that's it. So therefore, in Popadisa, they said, Ksuvas ben Dichrin is framed as an inheritance. So what it tells you is when mother dies, you have the ability to collect your ksuva from whatever is in the estate. But for argument's sake, if there's no more property in the estate, you don't have the ability to go ahead and claw back sold properties. On the other hand, so the Gemara says, so b'nei masa mechasya amri, but in masa mechasya they said, tarfa mishibadi. No, ultimately again, it's incredible. In order to collect the mother's ksuva, ultimately again, the sons could actually go ahead and claw back sold properties from the estate. Why? Yaspun to none. Because Rabbi say they used to use the lashon of yaspun. Yaspun means they will collect. Your sons will collect the ksuva, and Rashi points out yaspun is a lashon of a bal chov, of a creditor. So the same way that if the borrower owes the creditor money and the borrower defaults, but in the interim the borrower sold off property, the creditor has the ability to claw back sold properties, so too the sons have the ability to claw back sold properties. Incredible. So the Gemara says, what's the halacha? Lo tarfa mishibadi. How do you pass halacha l'maisa? Sons don't have the right to claw back sold properties. Why? Yar son to none. Because the lashon ultimately for ksuvas ben dichrin is a lashon of Yerusha. A lashon ultimately again of inheritance. And Rabbi say that is halacha l'maisa. It's very important. So therefore again, in every ksuba, it was standard that Reuven would write to Rachel, when you die, your sons will inherit your ksuva, independent of any other Yerusha considerations. But their ability to inherit the ksuva is based on the estate having property at the time of Rachel's death. If Reuven sold everything off and there's no property to collect from, the sons do not have the ability to claw back any additional properties. Incredible. Metaltali v'isnu beinahu below shavua. So let's listen to this. Let's say there's metaltalin. It's an interesting case here. So if you look at Rashi, metaltalin v'isne benayu. Let's say the estate has metaltalin. Now what's the case? Look at Rashi. Hamiyachid metaltalin, the first wide line of Rashi. Hamiyachid metaltalin l'ksuvas ishto, umeis v'hein be'en v'hinifraas mehen not lasan shalo b'shvua. Supposed to listen to this. So here's the case. Reuven marries Rachel, gives her ksuva. They're both say, in this case, what he did is, he identified metalton movable property as the source of payment for her ksuva. So say just for argument's sake, right? Reuven marries Rachel. He says, listen, I have a watch collection. So I'm identifying my two Rolexes as your ksuva payment. Okay, now Reuven dies. The Rolexes are here. Shabbos says, listen to this. So the halacha is below Shavua. So Rachel could collect the Rolexes as part of her ksuva payment, and she doesn't have to take a Shavua. Less nubeina. Shabbos says, actually, before we go on, so go back to that Rashi for just a moment. It's the last short line in Rashi. So we're talking about a man who identified movable property as the source of payment for his wife's ksuva. Umes. So now Reuven dies. Vehein be'en. The metaltalin is there. Vehine fraas men not lasa below shvua. So she can go ahead and collect from them without a shvua. Listen to this. The time of my amra banon minichse yisomim lo tifra ela b'shvua. The chayshinan dilmat srari at b'sa v'hacha hainu srari da'at b'sa. Well, let's listen to this. In general, there's a halacha that says, if you are collecting money from the estate of Yisomim, you can only do so with a Shavua. Right? Why? Because Rabbi say, Yisomim, the orphans, often don't know the affairs of the estate. So we're concerned that if someone's coming to collect from the debts, collect the debt from the estate, maybe they were repaid already, and they're trying to take advantage of the lack of knowledge of the Yisomim. Therefore, in order to go and avoid that, we say, okay, you want to collect the debt from the estate, no problem, you have to take a Shavua. So using that same logic, Reuven died, Rachel's the widow. Rachel wants to collect her ksuva from the estate. No problem. She should have to what? Take a Shavua. Well, the Gemara says, well, one second. If Reuven went ahead and identified metaltalin as the source of payment for the ksuva, and that metaltalin is there, it's in existence, she could collect that without a Shavua. Why? Because since that was identified as the source of payment for her ksuva, we're not concerned that she found some other form of payment. So if the Rolexes are there, they're in existence, she could take that without a Shavua. Now watch this. Pumpadisa, the Gemara says, Les nubenayu. Let's say he identifies metaltalin, but the metaltalin is not in existence, right? It's not in existence. Then what? Bless you. Pumpadisa amri below Shavua. The Pumpadisians say that she could collect it without a Shavua. Rabbi said the Pumpadisians' logic is that halacha l'maisa, we're not concerned that she took repayment from another source. And ultimately, Bnei Maseh Mechasi Amri B'Shua. Bnei Maseh Mechasi said, no, she's no different than anyone else who wants to take payment from the estate and therefore has to swear. V'ilchasa below Shavua. Rabbi say the halacha is she could collect metaltalin without a Shavua. Interesting. Next. Yichid la'arba mitzarna below Shavua. So listen to this same idea. A man, Reuven marries Rachel, and he identifies for her, your ksuva is going to be paid from this particular tract of land. And what does he do? He identifies the tract of land by identifying all four of its borders, which Rabbi means he's explicit about the piece of land that she is going to receive in payment for her ksuva. So what's the halacha? Below Shavua. Ultimately, she could collect this land without Rabbi because what's the logic? Remember again, Rabbi says, take a step back. There's a halacha. The halacha says, if you are collecting money from the estate of a Yisomim, what do you have to do? Shavua. Why? What are we concerned about? The Yisomim aren't on top of the affairs of the estate. So we're concerned that if you're coming to collect money, maybe you got paid already, and you're just trying to take advantage of the lack of knowledge of the Yisomim and collect again. The way we avoided is Shavua. So therefore, the widow is no different. So now, if halacha l'maisa, he promised her payment for her ksuva, and he identified a parcel of land, and he identified it by identifying all four borders, meaning he explicitly identified a piece of land, and the land is there, there's no concern that she got payment for her ksuva from an alternative source. Therefore, when he dies, and she wants to collect her ksuva, she could collect without a shvua. Bechad mitzra, what if he only identified it on one side? In other words, he didn't give explicit identification of the land. He said it's the land that borders, field number 3 on the eastern side. See, he wasn't as explicit as he could have been. So what's the halacha? So ultimately, the Pumbedisian said, still, he identified a piece of land. Granted, it wasn't as explicit as he could have been, but it's explicit enough to not be fearful that she received payment from another source. Bnei Masa said, no, she has to take a shvua. If it's not explicit, she has to take a shvua. V'ilchasa, below shvua. And we'll say the halacha is, as long as the land is identified in some way, even if it's not absolutely explicit, that it will allow her to collect ultimately again without a shvua. Rabbi say the logic of the Pumbedisians is, once you're identifying a source of payment, even if it's a non-explicit identification, that is enough to take away any concern that she has seized payment from another source. Incredible. Amar la'edin kisu v'chismu v'havulei kanumine lo tzarech im luchebe. So this is an interesting case. A man says to witnesses, kismu v'chasmu v'havu. Right, so this is talking about over here. Let's say a man says, Reuven says to witnesses, I want you to go ahead and kisvu, record a document, sign on it. Reuven wants to convey land to Shimon. He wants to give land to Shimon, right? So he says to witnesses, kismu v'chisvu. Go ahead and write down the transaction, sign it, and give it to Reuven. Give it to Shimon. Vavulei, kanumine, supposed to listen to this. If they made a kinyan, now the witnesses make a kinyan with Reuven to seal the deal. Lo tzarechim luchebe. Rabbi say they do not have to go ahead and consult with him again before recording the transaction document. Look at Rashi. About 8 lines up from the bottom. Lo tzarechim luchebe. Im adayin omid b'diburo sheyichtavu lo techeva dekanu mimenu stam kinyan liksiva omid. So Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. So Reuven says to witnesses, listen, guys, I want to gift property to Shimon. So do me a favor. Kismu v'chasmu, write it down, sign on it, and deliver it. And then the witnesses do a kinyan with Reuven, solidifying the transaction. Since they did a kinyan, before they record the gift, they don't have to check with Reuven again. Or they have to check with Reuven again. Why? Since they made a kinyan, and kinyan solidifies the transaction, we don't have to go ahead and check again. B'nei Pumbedisa amri lo tzarechim luchebe. B'nei Masa mechasya amri tzarechim luchebe. But B'nei Masa mechasya say, no, you have to go ahead and ask again. Before you write it down, you have to go ahead and ask again, just to make sure Reuven did not change his mind. To which the rest of it, tzarechim luchebe. And interesting, what's the halacha? Before recording it, you have to check back with Reuven that he indeed wants this transaction recorded in the document, that he still wants you to go ahead and record the document. Good. So I'll say, number of machloksim, mas mechasya b'nei Pumbedisa. Good. Weiter. So the Gemara goes on. Itma Rav Rabbi Yonos. Chad Amar, halacha k'Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah. V'chad Amar, in halacha Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah. So we'll say machlokes. A machlokes, Rav and Rabbi Nosson. One said, the halacha of Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, one said, so let's remember again. What did Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah say? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, yes, a man could add on to a ksuva, but Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, when is Tosefes collectible as of Nisuin? Nisuin, right? Iker ksuva could be collectible as of Erusin, but Tosefes only collectible as of Nisuin. Why? Rabbi say, what was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's logic? What was his logic? That a man only commits to the Tosefes when? After Nisuin. So says the Gemara Machlokes, who does the halacha follow? To stein Rabbi Nosson and the Amar halacha Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. It would appear that Rabbi Nosson is the one who says that the halacha follows Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Why? The Shamina with Rabbi Nosson, the Azal Basar Umdina. Rabbi say why? Because Rabbi Nosson himself goes what we call Basar Umdina. Rabbi say, what does Umdina mean? An assumption. See, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's psak is an assumption. What's the assumption? A man does not want to go ahead and commit to a tosefes, to additional amounts, until when? Until after Nisuin. Rabbi say that's what we call an umdina. A umdina is an assumption about human behavior. So Rabbi say, therefore, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah paskins, we go basar umdina. an assumption about human behavior. So interesting enough, the Gemara says it must be Rabbi Nassan, also Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, because Rabbi Nassan is also on record going basar umdina, an assumption about human behavior. Where do we see this? Here we go. Damar Rabbi Nassan, halacha Rabbi Shimon Shizuri b'mesukan. The halacha follows Rabbi Shimon Mizuri in the case of mesukan. So before you turn the daf, what's mesukan? What's this case? Look at Rashi. That's Rashi on the page. B'mesukan b'meseches gi'in hamefarish vayose b'sheara. V'amar kisvu get le'ishti. Let's listen to this. A man is going out on a long journey. Now, the example of long journey was shayar, a caravan. Caravans often crossed desolate deserts, and often people did not return from such journeys. So a man is going on a journey, and before he leaves, he says to another person, who says to two witnesses, Kisvu get le'ishti, write a get for my wife. We'll call the Ruvain is going on the journey. But what didn't Ruvain say? What didn't he say? Tenu. He said, write a get. What he didn't say was, give it. So the Gemara says, Shlomer Tenu, Hare elu yichtavu v'yitnu. The machmas tirdasa shu bal al nafshalo his pick. So we'll say, so we understand, even though Reuben didn't say Tenu, we understand that's what? That what? He meant Tenu. So why didn't he say it? He's preoccupied with the journey. Same idea, Rabosai, halacha l'maisr. Shimon Shizuri says, Mesukan, if someone's on his deathbed, and he says to witnesses, Kisfu get le'ishti. Now, remember again, why would someone on his deathbed be giving a get to his wife? Why? Yibum, right? Could be a consideration. Other possibilities, he doesn't like her, and he just doesn't want her to get mizonos after he dies. That's the other possibility. But we'll go with the Yibum possibility. So he says kisvu, but he doesn't say tenu. So Rav Shimon Shizuri says this is no different than the guy who goes out with the caravan, right? And halacha l'maisa, just because he was bohol, right? He was preoccupied with his circumstances. He didn't say tenu. So we'll say I'm a base, obitrumas meiser shal meiser. So again, I want to point out these are examples, Rabbi say, where we are going basar umdina. We're making an assumption. What's the assumption? That he meant to say tenu. Why didn't he say tenu? He was preoccupied. And same thing idea, Chumas Meiser Shel Demai. So Rabbi say the case of Chumas Meiser of Demai, Rashi points out, I'll just say this outside. Remember again, we know what Demai is, right? Demai is produce of an Ama Oretz. That halacha l'maisa Chazal said, you have to retithe because we're concerned that they're not tithing properly. So without getting into the intricacies of this case, remember again, Trumas Meiser is the portion that a Levi separates out. Let's say a Trumas Meiser of Demai that gets mixed in with Chulin. Now we could go ahead and preclude Yisrael from eating the entire mixture, which could represent the loss. In that case, we allow you to go back to the Amma Aretz and ask him straight up, Amma Aretz, did you tithe or not? And if the Amma Aretz said that he tithed, that'll be enough to take away the suffix nature of the mixture. Again, it's grouped together with this, but it's not what we need right now. So the Gemara says, so therefore, what do you see from here? You see Rabbi Nassan is of the opinion that we go basar umdina. We make assumptions about human behavior. Where do we see that? Man goes out on a long journey, or is a masukon, says kisvu get, didn't say tenu, we assume that he meant tenu. So it must be Rabbi Nassan is the opinion who holds that what? Rabbi Nassan is one who holds that the halacha follows Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, because Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah also goes basar umdina. Also, halacha l'maisa makes assumptions about human behavior. Rav lo azlo basar umdina, but Rav doesn't go ahead and make assumptions. He doesn't go after assumptions about human behavior. V'ha'itmar matnas shchiv mera shekasuv ba kinyan. Abba says interesting case. Let's say a shchiv mera. Abba says shchiv mera is a person who's on his deathbed. Right, Reuben's on his deathbed, and he's conveying a gift. Right, but in the shtar, he's conveying property. But in the shtar, he wrote a kinyan. Rashi says over matna shchiv mera elu tzricha kinyan shetiknu chacham dvar ksuvin kesurin kshol titrof dait v'alav v'mkasav ba kinyan. And Abba said, listen to this. The whole chap of a shchiv mera is that Chazal allowed a shchiv mera to convey property without a kinyan. Now, why did they do this? Because ultimately, again, they wanted to make things as easy as possible for a shchiv mera and wanted to eliminate as much worry and anxiety for shchiv mera as possible. So I will say, listen to this interesting case. Let's say a shchiv mera writes a document conveying something. But in the document, he also writes, quote unquote, a kinyan. So he's utilizing two things. He's utilizing the mechanism of conveyance of a shchiv mera but he's also utilizing the mechanism of kinyan. So the Gemara, Bebei Rab Mishvei Rav Amri, Arkave Atre Richshi. Such an individual ultimately again is going ahead, I will say, and what? Is going ahead and utilizing two steeds, right? He's utilizing ultimately again two horses, which I will say means what? Which is, in other words, that here the Shchiv Meira is utilizing two forms of kinyan. He's utilizing a form of kinyan of Shchiv Meira, and he's utilizing a form of normative kinyan. He's riding on two horses. So the Gemara says, Shmuel says, Lo Yedana Ma'idun Bey. I'm not sure exactly how to judge this transaction. Should we look at, because we'll get into the intricacies of this in tomorrow's daf, but essentially what's happening over here is Shmuel. So Rav says he's benefiting from two halachic mechanisms. Shmuel says, I don't know what to do with this. Right? When a Shchiv Meira does a matna Shchiv Meira, it also utilizes a normative kinyan. So do we look at this transaction as a Shchiv Meira transaction with all of its leniencies, or do we look at this as a regular transaction, i.e. a regular kinyan? That's the shayla. So the Gemara says, so I'll say, what does it mean when Rav said that he's riding on two horses? Harihi kematnas bari, v'harihi kematnas shchiv meira. So Rabbi says, very interesting. What we'll do is, we'll endow this transaction with the strength of both mechanisms, of what we'll call the gift of a regular person and the gift of a shchiv meira. How so? So the Gemara says, Hari kematnas bari, dim amad ena yachal lachzer bo. So I will say, this is very interesting. Now remember, in general with a matna shchiv, I will say, when a shchiv meira gives a gift, right, it's good news, unless what? It's an interesting idea. I will say, let's say again, right, you're right. So a shchiv meira gives you an incredible gift. I will say, so now what happens? And now Baruch Hashem, he has a complete and enduring refuah. And right, he's healed. And you say to yourself, wow, that's funny. I was not davening for him. Right? This entire, but yet again, he has the refuah shalema. So now you're in this awkward predicament. You're like, oh, that's good. Yeah, right? Baruch Hashem. Right? Fantastic. Only one problem. I'll say, see, the way a matna shchiv meira works, I will say, is it's only binding if he dies. Right? Because it's clear that the reason he's gifting the property to you is because he's ill. So matna shchiv meira, if he's healed, ultimately again reverts. So Rav says like this, it's very interesting. In this case, halacha l'maisa, the shchiv meira is riding on two horses. Number one, because he utilized the kinyan, it has the power of a matnas bari. Meaning what? Even if he is healed, nevertheless, the gift stands. And it's also kematnas shchiv meira, shem amar hilva'asi leploni, halva'asa leploni. I will say shchiv meira has the ability to convey, to give over a debt. Let's say someone owes the shchiv meira money. Normally, in order to transfer a debt from one party, you need a more formal mechanism. A shchiv meira could do it even just by mouth. So according to Rav, ultimately again, this matnas shchiv meira it utilizes both mechanisms. On one hand, it's a matnas bari, in that even if he's healed, the gift stands, but it's a matnas shchiv meira, in that he has the ability to convey things by word, even though normally it would require a kinyan. Shmuel Amar, Lo Yedana Ma'idun Bey. Shmuel says, I don't know what to do with this kinyan. So we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up with the sheet of Shmuel tomorrow, and then ultimately figure out if the halacha goes like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah or not. Shkoyach.